welcome to our final panel. We'll be speaking with three distinguished guests and anarchist thinkers about history in the present. The title of our panel is Kronstadt 1921 and the Social Crises of 2021. And so not only social crisis, but political crisis. And so over the course of these last 2 days, we've been looking at how history and the present are interwoven inextricably. Whether we're speaking of the similarities between the Kronstadt sailors and the Syrian revolutionaries, or the Hungarian revolutionaries, the revolutionaries of Prague Spring, Tiananmen, or even the protesters in Burma, Myanmar these days. There are many other cases in history. The Palestinian people, the Zapatistas, many examples of the Eros effect and of the revolutionary activation of the possibilities of hope for this future. And so what I'm going to do right now is to introduce our first speaker, Lynne Thorndycraft. And then we will hear from her and subsequently from Tom Wetzel and after from Bill Weinberg. And finally, we will conclude for half an hour with questions and answers, both internally on the panel as well as from the Twitch chat. So we welcome your questions and comments. And so without further ado, let me please introduce our first speaker, Lynne Thorndycraft, who kindly accepted our invitation to speak at the last day and the last panel of the Kronstadt conference this Sunday. And so Lynne Thorndycraft is the only surviving member of the Left Bank, of the original Left Bank Books Collective. Left Bank is an anarchist book fair founded in 1973, which still thrives in the Pike Place Market in Seattle. Her pamphlet, The Kronstadt Uprising of 1921, was Left Bank's first publication and Lynne's only published work. She in her life has worked for 25 years as a social worker, and since her youth in the 60s has been strongly opposed to Marxist-Leninism. She is now 72 and has not changed her mind. Please welcome Lynne Thorndycraft.
I was invited to speak at this conference. I was quite startled. I wrote the pamphlet, which led to the invite, in 1975. A couple of years ago, I had an interesting conversation with an anarchist in Toronto over rather a lot of wine. It was a solstice party about the coming anniversary and whether somebody ought to do something about it. Then life got in the way and I forgot all about it. Over the years, I've been gratified when Left Bank has republished the pamphlet, but I rarely thought about the contemporary relevance of the uprising. Imagine my surprise when Javier told me that Marxist-Leninism is having a revival among young people. He also linked me to an interview with two very young men who were drawn to this trend and later rejected it. The adherents are called tankies, whether pejoratively or not, I'm not sure, but it refers to approval of the tank-led Soviet invasions of Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968. So apparently, this is a thing. The young men said that it's partly because many youth are Googling the word socialism, partly out of their own limited prospects in capitalism, and partly because the word came up so often in Bernie Sanders' campaign. They said that Stalinism and Maoism are mostly what come up, especially on YouTube. The history seemed radical, extreme, and uncompromising, which can appeal to youth who are looking for a complete break from their upbringing. They both agreed that the large majority of their online companions were still in high school. They found entire archives devoted to every, quote, false claim against Stalin, etc., made by bourgeois capitalists. As I'm sure we've all experienced, the internet will helpfully guide you down any rabbit hole you even blink at. These young men suggested that young people may, quote, fetishize activity for its own sake and take the attitude that they may be authoritarian, but they did stuff. One of them felt that this phenomenon was, quote, less about authoritarianism and more about bloodlust and revenge. Certainly, the young have a great deal to be angry about in these times. So, no one can say the Kronstadt sailors never did stuff. They rose up in 1905 and 1906, and they celebrated the February Revolution of 1917 by executing their officers. In May, they established an independent commune in defiance of the provisional government. In July, they took part in the abortive rising against Kerensky. In October, they helped to bring down his government. They fought ferociously in the ensuing civil war against the White Army from 1918 to 1920. Trotsky called them the pride and glory of the revolution for their uninterrupted militancy in support of the fledgling Bolshevik government. But when the Civil War was over and the Bolshevik regime grew ever harsher and more dictatorial, Kronstadt rose up in support of the principles of the October Revolution. We've discussed this history enough, I think, that I can just review the demands they issued barely a week before the Bolshevik assault on the island. Only one of them, for the abolition of political departments in the fleet, referred to the sailors' specific situation. The other demands were in support of the rebelling workers of Petrograd and the peasants, a call for new elections because, quote, the present Soviets do not express the will of the workers and peasants, unquote. They called for freedom of speech and press to workers and peasants, to anarchists and left socialist parties, freedom for all political prisoners of socialist parties, removal of all roadblock detachments, which were seizing for the regime food and fuel people had scrounged in order to survive, the equalization of rations for everyone, and for the peasants to have, quote, full freedom of action in regard to the land, as long as they manage without employing hired labor, and to allow handicraft production on the same terms. These were the main demands of the Petropavlovsk Resolution. They were never addressed except by military attack. It was not a battle, said Tuchaevsky later. It was an inferno. The sailors fought like wild beasts. I cannot understand where they found the might for such rage. If you can bear with me, I'd like to read the conclusion of my long ago pamphlet. They didn't want the White Guards, but they didn't want us either, commented Lenin at the 10th Party Congress. Within days of the fall of Kronstadt, two things happened. His new economic policy was adopted, granting all of the economic demands of the sailors, with one very important distortion. It allowed the hiring of wage labor. Secondly, all opposition within the party was banned. Bukharin put it well. Opportunists have formed the opinion that at first we make economic concessions and then political. As a matter of fact, we make economic concessions in order not to be forced to make political concessions. There are a number of differing conclusions that may be drawn from the story of Kronstadt. The rebels were certainly not the revolution's guiltless children, as Averitt calls them. The maturity of political thought revealed in the Petropavlovsk Resolution should restrain us from condescension. The real argument revolves around what could loosely be called the issue of historical necessity. An added complication is that in a real sense there are two Leninisms, one motivating the Kronstadters, the other justifying their suppression. Socialism, said Lenin in 1917, is not created by orders from above. State bureaucratic automatism is alien to its spirit. Socialism is alive, creative, the creation of the popular masses themselves. Written immediately prior to October, State and revolution called for freedom of the press, the abolition of special bodies of armed men in favor of a people's militia, a state in which the workers would exercise power directly through their elected Soviets, and in which all left-wing parties could agitate freely. Was Lenin compelled by historical inevitability to abandon these hopes? Was he forced to substitute for the rule of the working class that of the technical intelligentsia? In his History of the Peasant War in Germany, Engels raises a possibility which may have haunted Lenin. The worst thing that can befall a leader of an extreme party is to be compelled to take over a government in an epoch when the movement is not yet ripe for the domination of the class he represents and for the realization of the measures which that domination would imply. He is compelled to represent not his party or his class, but the class for which conditions are ripe for domination. In the interests of the movement itself, he is compelled to defend the interests of an alien class and to feed his own class with phrases and promises, with the assertion that the interests of that alien class are their own interests. In the suppression of Kronstadt, the other Leninism comes into its own in the form of a tautology. Quote, the proletariat of itself was held to be incapable of rising above the level of mere trade union consciousness, unquote. Granting this, says R.V. Daniels, Lenin had an airtight case. Quote, any manifestation of independent revolutionary thought among the workers naturally had to challenge the authority of the party which purported to do the proletariat's thinking for it. Such a challenge of the party, given the definition of true proletarian thought as complete loyalty to the authority of the party, was ipso facto evidence of petty bourgeois trade unionist thinking of the declassing of the workers in consequence of the economic breakdown. Thus, by 1921, the organizational doctrine of Bolshevism had come full circle to the primeval Leninism of 1902. He's speaking of the book, What is to be Done. Excuse me. Albrecht suggests that the tragedy of Kronstadt is that one can sympathize with the rebels and yet justify the communist suppression of them. I suggest that the real tragedy is that so many people have for so long done just that. From Kronstadt to Berlin to Budapest and Prague, tyranny has been justified as somehow progressive. Even if one accepts the argument, and I do not, that their rise to power in situations of scarcity and underdevelopment is inevitable, there is no need to enshrine tyrants. The Russian Revolution suffered a mortal setback in 1921. What should concern us, says Nicholas Walter, is not the possibility that the succession of Kronstadt might have led to chaos, civil war, or counter-revolution, but the certainty that the failure of Kronstadt led to dictatorship, purges, and counter-revolution. So what is the importance of an uprising in Russia 100 years ago? It's the wrong question. It should be, what is the relevance of a model which has fomented dictatorship and human misery across the world, each time on the road to state socialism or state capitalism, take your pick, for over a century? Social revolution, in its essence, is a cultural transformation. It's, of course, very complicated in terms of how to defend it against the system it tries to overthrow. But the positive change hoped for is not rocket science. If something, whether beautiful or outrageous, sparks a sense that a better world is possible, if people get a glimpse of equality, justice, freedom, they will start to exhibit all kinds of behaviors that may seem extraordinary while our imaginations are burdened by capitalism. They will form cooperating groups, be it medics, food growers, all kinds of mutual aid systems. We are a social cooperative species, temporarily laid low by a vile and greed-based culture. We will not need to be led by experts, vanguard parties, or anyone who isn't willing to pull their own weight as best they can and measure their own needs in relation to the needs of other people and this desperately injured planet. I have been sad reading my old pamphlet and discovering how much I still admire the Kronstadt uprising, because I know I will probably not live to see the new world. But I've seen enough love and human decency to get me through this life and to think, surely we can do better. Thank you.
Okay, so our next speaker will be Tom Wetzel. Let me please introduce him. Tom Wetzel has worked in print production and as a technical writer in the computer manufacturing industry. He's written a long series of articles since the 1980s for the anarcho-syndicalist journal Ideas in Action, and sometimes on CNET and other media. The title of his talk will be Worker Congresses as a Form of Working Class Political Power.
My goal here is to talk about the solution that the workers and sailors of Petrograd put forward in 1921. The strike, as Lynn has pointed out, was a sympathy strike. It was basically an action in sympathy with the workers of Petrograd. Petrograd at that point, people don't sometimes know this, but 3/4 of all the military gear and supplies of the Red Army during the Russian Civil War were made in Petrograd. It was a major industrial city. And by the winter of 21, they were having a hard time getting wood to heat their homes, starvation level food rations, and that led to strikes and then martial law and the arrest of strikers. And so the Kronstadt sailors sent an investigating committee, and when they came back with their report, there were then assemblies on the various warships and in the various workplaces of Kronstadt. Kronstadt was still is the main naval base of the Russian Baltic Fleet, but it was also had thousands of workers in nearby industries. There were 13,000 workers in things like power plant, sawmill, factories making gear for the Navy and so forth. And so they had these assemblies. And their solution to the grievances of the workers of Petrograd and the social crisis that Russia was in at that moment was precisely to try to revive the kind of grassroots, multi-party, multi-tenancy democracy, Soviet democracy, that they had built in Kronstadt in 1917 to early 1918. And that's why the main political demand was for new Soviet elections, freedom of organizing, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, for all socialist and anarchist political organizations. That's why they came forward with that demand. So the question then is, well, what kind of organization was the Kronstadt Soviet of 1917? They had created that Soviet after they had revolted against their Tsarist officers and shot or arrested them in March of 1917. And so the Kronstadt Soviet of 1917 was the kind of organization that in the syndicalist tradition is called a worker congress. This means that in a region or area, the various workplaces, workers have assemblies, and they send delegates, they elect revocable delegates to a Congress, and this Congress then makes its assertion, it becomes the vehicle for working class assertion of social, economic, and political power in that region. And that's what the Soviet of Kronstadt tried to do in 1917, and they reached their maximum level of social assertion of power in January of 1918. In the meetings of the Soviet in January of 1918. And these were meetings of ordinary workers and sailors. As Israel Gessler says in his book about this Kronstadt Soviet, these were ordinary working people, but who were literate, who learned the ropes of making proposals in meetings, of public speaking, and so on. They made the decisions in Kronstadt, in their assembly of the delegates. And in January of 1918, an anarcho-syndicalist delegate, F.M. Yarkuk, proposed a whole series of measures. These measures were approved. They got majority support. He proposed that they overthrow the city government, the Duma, in the city of Kronstadt, and the Soviet would take over all of its public service functions. He proposed the socialization of all land on Kotlin Island, which is where Kronstadt is located. He proposed the socialization of all housing, which was a major issue in the Russian Revolution. In Petrograd, for example, during 1917, Petrograd was well known for having some of the worst and most expensive housing in Europe. And this was also an issue in Kronstadt as well, and hence their assertion of socialization of all housing. They also took over all the businesses in the city of Kronstadt, the banks, the saunas, the printing plants, everything. And the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks voted no, but they were defeated because they were not the majority. The dominant political tendencies in the Kronstadt Soviet in those years, and which continued to have an influence in the population there all the way up to the rebellion in 1921, the dominant political tendency was an alliance of the SR Maximalists and the anarcho-syndicalists. The SR Maximalists are an interesting organization. They were a libertarian socialist organization. They were the dominant political group in Kronstadt. They advocated for Russia's solution of replacing the old Tsarist regime with what they called the Toilers' Republic, which would be a horizontal federation of grassroots Soviets, multi-tendency, multi-party Soviets, with freedom of election, freedom of speech for all the political tendencies in the working class, in the producer population, peasants and workers in Russia. And they also agreed with the syndicalists in saying that the union should be independent of parties, not dominated by a particular political party. And they agreed with the syndicalists also in advocating collective worker management of production. And the reason why they were able to get these various socialization measures through the Kronstadt Soviet in January of 1918 is because they were part of a coalition of another political tendency that supported them, the left SRs. And so it was these political tendencies that were the dominant kind of thinking among the sailors and workers there in Kronstadt. They wanted a highly democratic, grassroots-controlled kind of political and social and economic power for ordinary people in Russia, for workers and peasants in Russia. What happened to the Kronstadt Soviet? Yeah, after the Communist Party gained a monopoly of state power under war communism in the later part of 1918, the Kronstadt Soviet was suppressed, and it was replaced by a bureaucratic system of party power in Kronstadt. The leaders of the Communist Party leaders appointed officers instead of elected officers that had previously existed. They had a whole system of spying, as the sailors called it. So the sailors had their own grievances. And this is why, as Lynne points out, the one demand they had in the rebellion in 1921 was to get away from the whole system of political control, of political commissars in Kronstadt. This is part of their proposal to revive the grassroots democracy of the Kronstadt Soviet. And at the very time that this rebellion took place, these issues are being fought out at the 10th Party Congress of the Communist Party, where Lenin and Trotsky both were beating the drum for what they call the dictatorship of the party, meaning that only the vanguard party, the Communist Party, would have political power or economic power. The workers' opposition was the primary opposition. And like the syndicalists and SR Maximalists, the workers' opposition were pressing for democratic worker control of industry and democratic economic planning through worker congresses. Again, this idea of worker congresses comes up. And as a result of that Congress, the workers' opposition was suppressed And because the rebellion in Kronstadt was a direct challenge to the moves towards increasing consolidation of the dictatorship of the party, that's why the political leaders felt they had to suppress it with violent force. But you can see here that, well, what I want to say here is that what we can see is that what the Kronstadt sailors and workers were proposing is in fact a viable solution, not only to the social crisis that Russia faced at that time, but is in fact still a viable solution to the crisis of contemporary capitalism. Because capitalism is a system of class oppression and exploitation over the working class, and to replace it, to replace the power of the owners and managers, the corporate and state bureaucrats, working people need to have their own economic and political power. Okay, and worker congresses, which was a solution proposed in Kronstadt, was their proposed solution. And it still is a viable solution. I just recently actually wrote an article that's been published today on Ideas in Action, which is the magazine of the political organization I belong to, called on Political and Economic Power, where I discuss in more detail this idea of worker congresses.
Bill Weinberg is an award-winning 30-year veteran journalist in the fields of human rights, indigenous peoples, drug policy, ecology, and war. He's the author of multiple books, including Homage to Chiapas and War on the Land. He's at work currently on a new title on indigenous struggles in the Andean nations and blogs daily on global autonomy struggles at Counter Vortex. And Bill will be speaking to us about the global left's reaction to the Syrian revolution.
Quoting the immortal words of Rosa Luxemburg, order reigns in Warsaw, order reigns in Paris, order reigns in Berlin. And so run the reports of the guardians of order every half century, from one center of the world's historical struggle to another. And the rejoicing victors do not notice that an order, which must be periodically maintained by bloody butchery, is steadily approaching its historical destiny, its doom. You stupid lackeys, your order is built on sand. So wrote Rosa Luxemburg in her famous essay of January 1919, Order Reigns in Berlin. She was assassinated the very day after she finished the essay, just as the last sparks of the Spartacist revolution were being extinguished. Hence, order reigns in Berlin. Her other historical references were to the Polish national uprising of 1831, brutally put down by Russian troops, and the Paris Commune of 1871, which also began at precisely this time of year, 150 years ago, March 18th, 1871. Now, up to then, Rosa Luxemburg was writing 3 years before Kronstadt. Leftist forces around the world had always cheered on popular insurrections. Kronstadt marked the first time that leftist forces around the world, with the exception of anarchists and other dissident elements, found themselves on the side of repression rather than rebellion. Today, a century later, this seems more and more to be the actual default position of the left, to the point that I'm really not sure in what sense it is still the left. Now, the Western left was divided on Hungary in 1956 and on Czechoslovakia in 1968. But again, with the exception of some dissident elements, it is not even any longer divided on its support for ultra-reactionary dictators today. Now, partly this is in response to the neoconservatives with their regime change hubris, culminating in the disastrous Iraq invasion. But much of the left today cannot distinguish a genuine revolution from an imperial intrigue and resort to the knee-jerk response of rallying behind dictators in virtually all circumstances. The Western left's response to the Arab Revolution that began in 2011 and really continues today has generally been an abject failure of solidarity, but nowhere more blatant and egregious than in Syria. 10 years ago this week, the Syrian revolution began with peaceful pro-democracy protests. The first demonstrations broke out in the city of Deraa after local school children painted a mural depicting scenes and slogans from the recent revolutions in other Arab countries and were detained and brutalized by the police. The Bashar Assad regime responded to the mounting demonstrations with serial massacres. After months of this, the Free Syrian Army emerged, initially as a self-defense militia to protect protesters. But the situation soon escalated to an armed insurgency. The regime lost control of large areas of the country, and local civil resistance committees backed by the FSA seized control. Assad then escalated to levels of violence rarely seen on Earth since World War II. The logic of the regime's response has always been to terrorize the populace back into submission, and ultimately to destroy society itself in areas outside regime control. Massive aerial bombardment soon escalated to serial chemical weapons attacks and massive Russian military intervention to back up the regime. The death toll in the war is now estimated over 500,000, with over 100,000 of those the disappeared who died in the dictatorship's prison gulag. A similar number are still believed to be in detention. It has amounted to a campaign of extermination, according to a 2016 study by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Over 13 million have been displaced, nearly half having fled the country as refugees, more in precarious and impoverished camps within the diminishing enclaves of rebel control. Syria has long been the world's greatest displacement crisis. And the response of the international left has literally been to blame the victims. The consensus position of the American left is now one in support of the Assad regime. Now, first, let us dispense with the requisite and knee-jerk disavowal that we inevitably hear. Oh, no, we don't support the regime. We just oppose U.S. intervention in Syria. Because that, quite simply, is a lie. When you parrot regime propaganda, when you depict the Syrian opposition as monolithically jihadist and deny the existence of a progressive civil resistance, when you cast doubt on Bashar Assad being behind the serial chemical attacks, you are loaning support to the regime and implicitly justifying its massive attacks on civilian populations. This is objectively support of the Assad regime. Now, it began with the sectarian left, the Answer Coalition, led at its core by the poorly named Party for Socialism and Liberation, more aptly dubbed the Party for Fascism and Dictatorship, the International Action Center, People's Power Assemblies, and others. These are all entities which emerged one way or another, either as offshoots or front groups from the Workers' World Party, whose origins go back to elements of the Trotskyist movement, who supported the Soviet invasion of Hungary in 1956, and subsequently started moving back in a pro-Stalinist direction. Today, these groups actually march with portraits of the genocidal dictator Bashar Assad at their hypocritical anti-war rallies. But the poison has spit itself throughout the so-called left at this point. Noam Chomsky, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, Democracy Now!, when it has featured such experts as Seymour Hersh, have all been guilty of this. Max Blumenthal and Ben Norton of the odious Gray Zone rally around any regime that the U.S. ostensibly opposes, most notably that of Bashar Assad. And the crowning irony is that the U.S. doesn't even oppose the Assad regime in more than words, increasingly in few and equivocal words at that. The U.S. provided some aid to the Free Syrian Army early in the war, but has actually restrained rebel forces from using this aid to fight Assad, insisting they only use it to fight ISIS and other jihadist forces such as the Nusra Front. Biden's recent airstrike on an Iranian base in Syria was among but a small handful of times that the U.S. has bombed forces aligned with the Assad regime, each time to requisite protest from the American left. Meanwhile, there was overwhelming silence from the anti-war forces in the West over Trump's virtual destruction of the city of Raqqa, despite the massive civilian toll, because in that case, the U.S. was fighting ISIS, not the Assad regime. Even the world media barely paid note to the destruction of Raqqa. This despite the fact that the Assad regime has certainly killed far more Syrians than has ISIS. And Assadist forces have actually re-entered Raqqa for the first time since 2013, following the city's U.S.-directed liberation 4 years ago. So the Pentagon, like these anti-war fools, is objectively on the side of the Assad regime. Worse, very recent history is going right down the Orwellian memory hole. Most leftists think the Syrian revolution was and is CIA astroturf and or jihadist extremism. And even the anarchist dissidents in the West, supporters of the Rojava autonomous zone in Syria's northeast, who were inspired by the Kurdish revolutionaries, drawing from the anarchist and communalist ideas of Mary Bookchin, even they know nothing about the similar ideas of Syria's own Omar Aziz, the Damascus-based anarchist theorist who was an early influence on the general Arab Syrian revolution. He helped shape the model of council-based radical democracy, people seizing power from below in local coordination committees, as they were called. He was, of course, detained and died in Assad's prisons in 2012. And here I must give big kudos to my Syrian friend and comrade, Leila Al-Shami, for keeping the legacy of Omar Aziz alive. Very important work. I urge people to Google up her most recent article for a publication called The Somnambulist, entitled Building Alternative Futures in the Present, the Case of Syria's Communes. But most leftists in the West have never even heard the name of Omar Aziz. Now, Russia in 1921 was still a revolutionary state, although even there, the capitalist restoration program of Lenin's new economic policy had a lot to do with the context for the Kronstadt uprising. But Assad's Syria was and is by no means an anti-capitalist or revolutionary state, despite its bandying about of the word socialist in Hitlerian manner. Quite to the contrary, it is a deeply reactionary, indeed fascistic and kleptocratic state, and thoroughly a part of the world order that Rosa Luxemburg prophesied was built on sand. That self-identified leftists around the world are rallying to the defense of this regime is the most shameful betrayal imaginable. Thank you.
Thanks to our panelists. And so now we're going to pass to a question and answer period. So I know that there are some questions and comments in the chat, but before we get to those, I do want to pose my own questions to the panelists. And so first off, if I could begin with Tom, if you could please tell us, Tom, a bit about the history of the International Workers Association and its founding almost a century ago. I believe it was founded in December of 1922 in Berlin. Is that right? If you could tell us a little bit about that and how that was connected to the Kronstadt Commune and how you think, syndicalism is relevant to the struggle today.
At the time of the Russian Revolution, the Communist Party leadership was trying to they're trying to create an international, a communist international under their control. And one of the most important international forces for revolutionary politics were the revolutionary or syndicalist unions, which were particularly large in Latin America and places like Spain and Portugal and other places. And so they created an organization called the Red International of Labor Unions to try to draw in the syndicalists, right? And in fact, unions like the IWW and the CNT initially did affiliate to the Communist International. But one of the major factors that eventually led to a complete break between syndicalism and the communist movement was indeed the Kronstadt rebellion. And what it was associated with was the increasingly repressive tendencies of the regime in Russia, and especially the power given to a bureaucratic managerial regime. Lenin had said that workers must obey unquestioningly the managers appointed from above. And during the Civil War, that became uniform. That was what was imposed. And the most important anarcho-syndicalist organization in Russia, the Confederation of Russian Anarcho-Syndicalists, was still active in 1921. And what's interesting here is that after the Party Congress in 1921, when the workers' opposition was suppressed, there was a report somewhat later from the security apparatus of the communist regime saying that the most dangerous opposition group was the Confederation of Russian Anarcho-Syndicalists, because the rank and file communist trade union members supported the workers' opposition. They were moving over to the anarcho-syndicalist organization. The anarcho-syndicalist organization was growing rapidly. The anarcho-syndicalist organization also had sympathizers among the teachers in the Red Army training camps. And so they were a major threat. The communist leaders saw them as major threats. So they, at that point, completely suppressed that organization, arrested all of its leaders, shut off its, closed down its printing press. And that was one of the factors that led the international syndicalist movement, all the various unions, to disaffiliate from the Communist International and to create their own international, the International Workers Association, the following year in 1922. So yeah, the suppression of anarcho-syndicalism in Russia was one of the key factors that led to the break between, as well as, of course, the creation of a bureaucratic managerialist regime and industry over workers. Those are the key factors in the break between syndicalism and communism.
Thank you, Tom. Now I have a question for both Lynne and Bill. And this is coming from the chat on Twitch. And so the question is, how do you think we can effectively fight authoritarian leftism, or this red fascism, as Volin termed it, or Marxist-Leninism? Do you have any suggestions or proposals for how we might progress on this front? Thank you.
Team up with young people. I've been very hopeful and impressed by the climate action groups, at least all over Canada. And I'm just remembering a meeting I went to once. There's about 60 people in the room. They went around the room. Everybody said how they were doing and gave their pronouns. Halfway through the meeting, which was about various organizing proposals and so forth, there was a break while everybody sang together. And at the end of the meeting, we sang again. It was very different than the kind of meetings I attended in the left in the 60s and 70s, and much more fun. And there was not a discernible hierarchy, and there were not people who appeared to have a great deal of trouble with narcissistic personalities, of which, for instance, Lenin was. It was I guess that is my answer. Okay.
I'm heartened by the fresh blood in the in the American left broadly defined, one of the most inspiring things which really kept me going through this past, horrific year is, of course, the Black Lives Matter uprising that we witnessed over the summer, and years where a new leadership came to the fore, and these old, tired, morally bankrupt, sectarian outfits like Workers' World and PSL and so on. They try to every time you've got Black Lives Matter, Occupy Wall Street, Extinction Rebellion, etc. They try to using the tactic of entryism. They make an effort to try to infiltrate and co-opt and usurp the leadership of these movements, but it hasn't been successful. And whereas, they really did become hegemonic in the quote unquote anti-war movement, which has become very moribund at this point. So that's a sign of hope. The whole, resistance against Trumpism, there were, certain concerns, particularly on the part of, the old sectarian left, that it was co-opted by the Democratic Party. But I didn't really see that. And certainly, I think that was more, jealousy on their part that it wasn't co-opted by them. So I do see signs of hope that there is a newer, younger, fresher, and in fact, more militant element, which is coming to the fore now. And that, us old timers should be throwing our support behind them without attempting to, inflict our leadership on them. Of course, that doesn't mean I'm going to be silent about my criticisms and critiques. I never am, but I'm certainly not aspiring to any position of leadership.
I actually have a question for you, which is, two-part question. If you could briefly speak to, there have been some comments in the chat about Rojava. If you could speak a bit about Rojava and the relationship between the Syrian revolution and the Rojava revolution, and how you see Western leftist and anarchist attitudes toward these respective revolutions. And also, because this has been a recurring theme over the last 2 days, can you give us your take on gray zone? Like, what drives gray zone? Is it just grifting? Is it just a matter of profit making?
Wow, that's a lot to address. I'm going to start off by addressing the whole question of Rojava. One of the most frustrating things about this, the whole Syria situation and how the American left has reacted to it is that, again, the kind of the consensus position of the American left has been in support of the Assad regime, and the dissident elements, and fortunately there are dissident elements, unfortunately they themselves have been divided. The most significant dissident element are the anarchists who are rallying around the Kurdish revolution in Rojava, as I am. But they have, they've largely remained very, very resistant to the notion of solidarity with the more general Arab-led revolution in Syria. And while they know all about Murray Bookchin, white guy from Vermont, and his influence on the Rojava Kurds, they don't know anything about Omar Aziz and his influence on the local coordination committees, which were the sort of council affinity group based model of the general Arab Syrian revolution. Now, what's happened on the ground in Syria, unfortunately, and there was a really beautiful moment in 2014, 2015, when the Rojava Kurds allied with elements of the Free Syrian Army to fight ISIS, and they were unified against both ISIS and the Assad regime. Unfortunately, that alliance did not last, and this was largely due to the intrigues of great powers, which got involved in Syria and started carving up the country into their influence zones. And you had Russia was intervening on behalf of the Assad regime. Turkey intervened on behalf of the Free Syrian Army. And of course, Turkey is, the government of Turkey and Recep Tayyip Erdogan bitterly opposed to any notion of Kurdish autonomy because of the precedent that it sets for the Kurds within their own territory. So, and then the Kurds themselves, the Rojava Kurds themselves, they kind of were groomed as proxies by the United States, and it's one of the most bizarre ironies of the past 2 years is that the truly fascistic Trump administration here in the United States was backing an anarchist-oriented Kurdish revolutionary movement in Syria, but that was the case because the Kurds were the most effective force on the ground fighting ISIS. They were very, very motivated, and they were really kicking ISIS's ass. So there was kind of a pact which was formed between the Kurdish militias and the Pentagon. And when the Pentagon bombed Raqqa into smithereens, it was in support of the Syrian Democratic Forces, which was the main militia alliance led by the Kurds, who ultimately took the city. Now, what happened subsequently to that, about a little bit more than a year and a few months ago, is Turkey and its own proxy forces in the Arab militias in the northwest of Syria invaded Rojava. So and actually usurped a large chunk of what had been the Rojava Autonomous Zone. And just like under attack from the Assad regime and Russia, the Arab Syrian rebels were forced to into an alliance with Turkey. Well, now under attack from Turkey, the Kurds were forced into an alliance with the Assad regime. So now the Kurds are allied tentatively, mind you, because Assad is no friend of Kurdish autonomy either. So this is definitely a strained alliance, but on the basis of their mutual enmity for Turkey and the forces which it's been collaborating with, there was a pact which was forged between the Rojava Kurds and the Assad dictatorship. So now the prospect for any kind of unified front between the Arab rebels and the Kurdish rebels is almost been completely blown to smithereens. So this is really, really tragic. And it's also, here, and the thing is, the Kurds under attack from Turkey and from ISIS, and, the Arab rebels under attack from Russia and Assad, they are in the position where they're forced to make very, very difficult decisions, under circumstances not of their own choosing. So we should be, we shouldn't be so quick to judge them for having to make these tough choices. But we here in the United States, we are not having to make these tough choices. And we've got a little bit of distance and privilege, which we should take responsibility for and try to, view the whole thing without this, condescending attitude of being so quick to judge people who have had to make very difficult decisions. So, I was not happy about the fact that the Rojava Kurds were allied with U.S. imperialism, but I understood what drove them to that alliance. And similarly, I'm not happy about the fact that many of the Arab rebel factions are accepted Turkish protection, but I understand what drove them to that alliance. So today, it's a very, very difficult, very, very tragic situation. I call for rebuilding Arab-Kurdish unity, and there are dissident elements on both sides which do, in fact, support rebuilding Arab-Kurdish unity. And there was that window of about a year, beginning with the eruption of ISIS in 2014, when, in fact, there was that a pact between elements of the FSA and the Rojava Kurds. So that was a real shining example of what's possible. Hopefully, we're going to be able to avoid an Arab-Kurdish ethnic war in northern Syria, which could be a greater disaster than we've even yet seen. But it's really important that we in the progressive circles in the left, in our own in our own rhetoric and analysis, avoid playing into the trajectory towards ethnic war in Syria and do what we can to support the forces which are actually working towards rebuilding Arab Kurdish unity. It's a very, a very dangerous situation. Certainly, this isn't even an issue for, unfortunately, the more consensus position of the left, which is in support of the Assad regime, and has been the most egregious exponent of this, apart from the sectarian elements that I discussed, such as Workers' World and the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Gray Zone has been the most egregious exponent of this.
All right, thank you, Bill. Appreciate it. So now I'm going to ask if any of the co-panelists have any reactions to what Bill was saying, or I also have other questions for you all. No, okay. Lynn, so in your pamphlet, and I'll have to unmute you in a moment, but in your pamphlet, you described the post-revolutionary Bolshevik state and the Kronstadt sailors as implementing the two Leninisms. So I was wondering if you could just speak to the distinction that you see between these two Leninisms and what exactly distinguishes these two.
I haven't read either of these in 50 years, but in 1902, Lenin spelled out very clearly his idea of vanguardism and the need to have a vanguard party in charge of any revolutionary development. In 1917, he wrote actually a very inspirational book called State and Revolution, right before the October uprising, or perhaps, maybe before the February, I'm not sure. But at any rate, I read a quote from that, which is relatively democratic, worker controlled, all kinds of the things that typically anarchists would want. And I have read some writers who think that it was actually written as sort of a sop to anarchists and people to the left of Lenin. I don't have an opinion on that. But those are the two Leninisms I'm talking about. And they are very opposed to each other and mutually contradictory. So that's what I meant.
My next question is for Tom. So Tom, you were mentioning that Kronstadt was in a certain way a sympathy strike with the striking workers of Petrograd. And I think maybe we can see a similar realization of this kind of insurgent movement in the idea of a political strike. I don't know if you would agree with me. That's my first part of my question. The second part of my question is if you could speak to how you think a class struggle perspective can help to improve internationalism on the left.
Capitalism, is an international system, and particularly has become more so, in fact, with globalization and with the distribution of assets of firms around the world, increasing growth of firms straddling national boundaries, so that it makes sense in terms of improving the leverage and bargaining power and social power of workers to think in terms of supporting struggles of workers in other countries. So, for example, there was recently actually some strikes of Mexican workers at General Motors in support of their sympathy strikes with American workers. And there was this massive uprising in Matamoros, just not too many months ago, of parts workers. And this is something where auto workers in the United States need to be thinking in terms of how can they build the sort of cross-border solidarity, which would, if they have coordinated actions over an international scale, that would greatly increase their power. And if you look at, for example, with the case of Amazon, there have been actually in Europe coordination efforts between Amazon workers in Italy, Spain, and Germany. And that's an example of kind of the inklings of, beginning elements of a kind of international unionism. And so that's where the international aspect comes in. But see, the problem is, I think also that in the United States, it's very hard to talk about people taking action in support of workers in other countries if people won't even take action in support of themselves, in support of people, other people in their city. And I think that the fundamental problem here is the rebuilding of unionism from the ground up, because we're at a situation where only 6.2% of workers in the private sector even belong to unions, any unions. And so the key thing there is going to be the rebuilding of worker-controlled and democratically controlled worker unions. And this is why I keep beating the drum for building new unions. And we have examples of workers trying to do this, like with the going on again, the Amazon workers in Alabama right now trying to unionize. And I think so that's like one of the basic things that needs to be done, a rebuilding of a kind of social working class movement from the base, building up that base in the workplaces. And then you can have also links to other kinds of social movement organizations. So for example, I was at a convention of the Railway Workers United, which is an oppositional network of rank and file workers in the craft unions, the bureaucratized craft unions in the railway industry. They were getting a lot of support for their demands for in opposition to going over to like one-person trains, which the companies want to do. That'd be so unsafe, And if you had these problems of crashes of trains, workers being killed, there's a direct link there to, for example, the more explosive character of fracking oil, and why, therefore, the environmental justice movement, the climate justice movement, has gone to meetings in support of the demands of the railroad workers, and against massive oil trains that are very unsafe. That kind of. That's an example of developing links between different social movements to lay a groundwork for the possibility of solidarity actions.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. And so I'm going to leave the last question for Bill. Okay, so get ready, Bill. Next question is going to be for Lynne. And I'm going to unmute you again. But my question for you, Lynne, is in your pamphlet, you write, and I quote, and as you read, but to emphasize this again, quote, you write that the real tragedy is that so many people have for so long believed that tyranny has been justified as somehow progressive, end quote. I think this theme has been coming up time and again in our 2-day conference. And so I thank you for making that acknowledgement. And I'm very pleased that we have highlighted this theme indeed. I just wanted to briefly ask you if you could tell us how you see this dynamic having played out since you've written this pamphlet in history and in politics.
What's happening in Burma now definitely demands our attention. It needs to get a lot more coverage and a lot more, active solidarity for the protesters. Critical. Democracy, even, this bourgeois democracy, which affords at least a little bit of elbow room for freedom for workers and common people, is under attack all over the world. The defeat of Trumpism in this country was, I feel, a step back from the brink, but the coup in Burma is another step closer to the brink for the entire world. And certainly, some upwards of 100 people now have lost their lives in the repression, possibly as high as 200. Definitely demands active solidarity. Thus far, the American left hasn't said anything that I've noted which is egregiously stupid about it, but nor have they said anything which is particularly courageous or incisive about it either. They're kind of ignoring it for the most part. I feel there should be active solidarity with the protesters. And I anticipate, mind you, because it hasn't happened yet, but hopefully it won't. But nonetheless, I anticipate that we're going to run into some trouble there with the recent demand of the protesters for R2P, responsibility to protect, where they're actually calling for the United Nations, to intervene in some sense there to halt the repression before it escalates to the point of genocide. And I can see that, there's going to be the knee-jerk response once again that, this is all about, Western humanitarian intervention and regime change and blah, blah, blah. Again, it hasn't happened yet. Hopefully it won't. Maybe I should bite my tongue lest I give the sectarian left any ideas. Which brings us to the whole question of sectarianism. I mean, when people call me an ultra-leftist or, I'm subject to an infantile disorder, whatever, I don't really care. I wear it as a badge of pride. I'm an ultra-leftist. Fine, no problem. When people call me a sectarian, that really irks me because of the dishonesty of it. I'm anti-sectarian. And usually the people who call me a sectarian are sectarians. I mean, I oppose these sectarian outfits like Workers' World and Party for Socialism and Liberation and their, attempts to undermine and co-opt and assert genuine grassroots movements like Black Lives Matter and Extinction Rebellion and Occupy and so on. I haven't engaged in any underhanded methodology like that. And if I'm a sectarian, what's my sect? I don't have a sect. Where's my sect? It's complete nonsense. I am in absolutely no sense a sectarian. I am an anti-dogmatic, ecumenical anarchist. And I'm not even a dogmatic anarchist. I mean, I've read Bookchin. I've got Bookchin's books on my bookshelves. I use the word book 3 times in that sentence, including the book and Bookchin. But I'm not like a dogmatic Bookchinist. I'm not even a dogmatic Weinbergist. I question myself all the time. So it's just total jive. I'm not a sectarian by any stretch of the imagination.
Appreciate the co-panelists and the audience members for tuning in and commenting and questioning. We'll be back in just a few minutes with our closing event, words from our co-sponsors, and an open forum for everyone who wants to join us. So stay tuned. Thanks, everyone.